Hello class and welcome back as we continue with Chapter 4 on the Age of Absolutism, today focusing on a conflict that's going to be arising in Great Britain. So please title your notes for today, the English Civil War. So the religious differences that we've been exploring really since the Reformation are going to make their way into England during this time, into another conflict that's going to be emerging, much like the ones that you've seen in Spain, in France, in Central Europe, this time in a clash between Parliament and very religious figures in Parliament known as Puritans, and others who they deem to be sacrilegious. So, just a little bit of background information. England had a long history of attempting to limit the power of monarchs previously, and that is seen no more clearly than in the Magna Carta, which you may have seen in the past or at least talked about. So, pause the video here and answer this question. How exactly does the Magna Carta attempt to prevent an absolute monarchy from forming in the future? Again, pause the video as needed, answer the question, and then resume. Just to provide some clarity, you can see a few key instances here of different ways that the Magna Carta is attempting to contain or limit what the king or royal officials are allowed to do. It says no royal official shall take horses or carts from any free man. No royal official will take wood out of our castle for any purpose. No official shall place a man on trial without some sort of evidence to actually back it up to prove his guilt. You can see that these are all different ways that would very much change the idea of divine right, which we've talked about previously, in that the king can essentially do whatever he wants. So Queen Elizabeth I, who we talked about previously, had frequent conflicts with Parliament. England was in a great deal of debt during the time. Parliament kept clashing with her, and they were trying to prevent her from becoming an absolute monarch and taking this, unbridled power. She never has children, so she really is the end of the Tudor line, and it's her cousin James Stuart who ultimately takes the throne after her death. James also inherits the debt that was accumulated during Elizabeth's reign, and you'll see that that's going to come to define much of his time in power. Just to show you what the royal lineage really looks like, you can see here we have King Henry VIII as well as his three children who will all rule. First Edward, then Mary, then Queen Elizabeth. And then after Queen Elizabeth dies, it actually goes to the next person in line who would be her cousin, King James I. So James's problem is that Parliament was home to many Puritans, a group who you'll be talking about a lot next year in U.S. History 1 in the form of Puritan New England and Puritan culture in the New World. But they want to do a few different things. They want to purge the English Church of Catholics. They don't like Catholic rituals. They don't like Catholic beliefs. And they also want to publish a new Puritan Bible that takes religion much more seriously. James I is going to rule from 1603 to 1625, but it's actually his son who we'll really be focusing on today, Charles I. Just to give us some information about James, though, take a look at this, his essay on the true law of free monarchies. Do the same thing that you did previously, pause the video, and answer these two questions. What belief does James I seem to express about monarchies and their relationship with Parliament? And number two, did he think that common people could overthrow a cruel monarch? So again, pause the video, answer these questions, and then come back. Just to provide some clarity, James I says that kings are called gods. It lies in the power of no parliament to make any kind of law or status without the king's word. So basically saying that Parliament has absolutely no authority to control the king's power because the king has been selected by God, hence divine right, to rule over the country. James goes on to say a wicked king is sent by God for a curse to his people and a plague for their sins. So essentially he's arguing that if conditions are bad, if crops are failing, if there's warfare, people are suffering, it's not because the king is doing a bad job. It's actually a punishment by God for the subjects being bad. It's a punishment for the sins of the subjects, not for the ineptitude or, lack of wisdom of the king. So Charles I, much like his father, is constantly in need of money. He is embroiled in the 30 Years' War with Spain and France, which is obviously very expensive, but Parliament refuses to help him until he signs away a great deal of his power via the Petition of Right. And just to show you what the Petition of Right looks like, take a look at this primary source document. This is ultimately signed by King Charles I, but answer this question. How is this attempting to limit the king's power and prevent an absolute monarchy? Pause the video here, answer that question, and then resume for clarity. So just to go through this together, you can see that there are a few different ways that this is really trying to contain the power of the king. It says that the king cannot take a loan or take advantage of the royal treasury without the permission of Parliament. It says that you can't force common people to pay taxes and tillage, provide aid without the consent of Parliament. You cannot imprison someone without some sort of evidence or some sort of basis for their imprisonment. They also can't be outlawed or exiled for long periods of time without some sort of judgment. You can say by judgment, by the lawful judgment of his peers. Very much similar to what we'll ultimately see in the Bill of Rights in the U.S. Constitution. A lot of that emerging during this time here as well. And then finally, people basically can't be taken advantage of or dismissed of their inheritances. They can't be put to death just by the whim of the king. All of this is the authority of Parliament, not by an individual person. So just to go through this and clarify, Charles I ultimately does sign the Petition of Right. So it says that he won't imprison subjects without due cause, he won't levy taxes without Parliament, he will not house soldiers in private homes, and he will not impose martial law during peacetime. All things, again, that will be popular desires among colonists during the American Revolution. So Charles I signs, but he largely ignores the Petition of Right. Much like his father, he wants to maintain absolute power in England, and he goes on to get the money that he desires by imposing fees and fines on his citizens. Keep in mind that many people still do believe in the concept of divine right during this time period, and even though they're unhappy with the taxes, there are many people who still support the king. So Charles I aims to maintain the Anglican Church that was set up by Henry VIII and Queen Elizabeth I. He tries to force Scotland to also accept Anglicanism. Scotland, of course, is part of England during this time. He wants one unified religion. But don't forget, think back to our chapter on the Reformation. Scotland was a Presbyterian nation at the time, a subset of Calvinism. And it basically leads to this massive rebellion. England threatens to invade, and it leads to quite an expensive and brutal conflict between the two parts of the country. Charles I calls on Parliament for money and support, and it leads to massive conflict. Parliament starts passing laws to limit Charles I's power, and they basically force Charles to flee from London to save his own life. A civil war emerges between Parliament and those who support the king. On one side, we have the Royalists, aka the Cavaliers, people who support Charles I, and on the other side, we have the Puritans in Parliament, aka the Roundheads, because of the helmets that they wore, who were supported by Parliament. Just to show you the different iterations or changes during the English Civil War, you can see the two sides ultimately taking, parts of England during this time, going back and forth between the two of them, and then the red stars are important battles. So this ultimately leads to a civil war that's going to result in Charles I's execution. The Puritans come to be led by a man named Oliver Cromwell, who puts together a new model army, a superior fighting force, and he begins putting down the Royalists, those who support the king. Charles I is ultimately captured and brought to trial, and he's decapitated. Here's what's so important and what you really want to emphasize in your notes and want to make sure that you understand. Never before had a monarch been murdered so publicly. Monarchs, again, were thought to be almost like gods on earth. Think of divine right. And many people didn't believe that a king or queen could die in such a way, like God would not will it to happen. So in this very infamous scene where you have Charles I being decapitated, and if you look very closely, you can see it occurring here in this caricature, Oliver Cromwell holds up his head to the audience and people shriek and gasp, unable to process that this is even a possibility. This is going to be an inciting incident for a time period that's coming just around the corner, the era of revolutions. Think of like the French Revolution and several of the others, that are going to follow, where you have aristocrats and wealthy people and monarchs being decapitated and murdered by common people. And this is really the first instance, notable instance of it happening.